Hello, and welcome to episode 4 of Surface Tension, the podcast from Shobana and Jeyasingh Dance. I'm Sanjoy Roy, dance critic for The Guardian. This year the company turns 30, and to mark the occasion, we're looking back over Shobana's 3-decade career as a leading dance choreographer and chatting to an incredible range of people who have collaborated with company over the years. In episode 3, we discussed site-specific works, and today we turn our attention to science and science fiction. What has that got to do with dance, you might ask? Well, if you listen to our podcast on Shobana's very first work, Configurations, you'll notice there's a lot of maths in it. And in fact, numbers and systems were the basis for several of Shobana's early pieces. But Shobana has branched out a lot since those days, having collaborated with scientists from several different disciplines, including cell biology, robotics, and medicine. Also, Shobana counts a number of science fiction films as formative influences on her choreography, including Bladerunner, The Matrix, and Terminator 3. So I'm here with Shobana to ask, what are the connections in your work between science and dance, or between science fiction and choreography? Thanks for joining us today, Shobana. Now, I know that you studied literature to master's level, and people in general are not so surprised by that. So let's turn straight away to science and science fiction. Where did that interest first come from?
I think the kind of science fiction that's interested me the most is where the maker of the film has to imagine a society, and particularly a human being, that has some connection to us so that actually we engage with them, but they're different enough for us to know actually they're not quite like us. So it's that kind of imagining a body, that's really what interested me.
And just tell me about science as such. Was that a subject you studied or have always been interested in?
Sadly, not really. Unfortunately, I didn't really pay much attention in my biology lessons, which I wish I had now. But as I've got deeper into choreography, and also having my son go through biology A-levels, I really became reacquainted with biology in a totally different way. And, I just found it absolutely fascinating because, I spend my time looking at bodies. I'm very interested in the human body in its neuroscientific way, in a totally biological way, developmental way, in its futuristic way, because obviously we're still evolving. And I find that really exciting.
Can I just quote something that you said, which I took as advice to the audience? Watch a dance work as if it were a science fiction film. Now, I've never had that advice from anyone else. What were you thinking?
Because I think whenever I watch, especially contemporary dance, which makes up its own narratives and it makes up its own grammar of movement, by doing that, you're putting it in a particular environment. You're also, when you create duets and trios and ensemble work, you're kind of creating a kind of society, really. You're laying down some patterns of behavior, of etiquette, of physical convention, of culture. So in many ways, you're a bit like a science fiction writer. You're taking these 3 elements of space, time, body, and you're making some sort of product of the imagination. In a way, it's totally futuristic. We're trying to put it in a much more speculative world created by humans in time and space, which don't actually exist in real time.
The speculative world that you invent choreographically, how does it become recognizable? Because that's, I think, an important thing for you is it has to have some connection with us, even if it's noticeably different.
One of the challenges of making contemporary dance work is that obviously you're inventing your grammar to a certain extent. It's a bit like you're making up a language as you go along in the studio. But then you also want to communicate that language. So it's a bit like you've thought of the grammar, but nobody else knows what the rules are. So I think as a choreographer, you try and find strategies whereby you acquaint the onlooker with your conventions so they actually feel familiar. With human language, with dance language, there are, simple things, repetitions, all the things that composers do, motifs, because I think a composer does something similar because, again, it's a speculative world made of sound, but they create a sort of an accommodation with the hearer or the onlooker by deploying, there's some very classic things whereby you get the audience to look and you draw them in. I think repetition is really useful. time for the eye to rest in certain images, how you deploy from the very beginning. Hopefully you build up a coherence. So, whether it's a duet or a trio or a quartet or a quintet, people are still behaving in ways that actually cohere.
Another thing I would add there is maybe that a dancer, we have connections to them because they're also human beings. Even if they're behaving in kind of odd ways on the stage, we sense them as like humanoids as well as humans, and you have that freedom of identification and difference.
Yeah, because you're creating an artificial entity in contemporary dance choreography. It's a creature made of artifice, but on human recognizable material.
One of the early works that you made, which was Phantasmaton, which was 2002, you told me there that one of your big influences was a book. An idea from, in a way, science fiction became a key idea to explain yourself.
Yeah.
Can you tell me more about that?
I know, as an Indian female in Britain, in the studio, I was doing certain types of movements. I was creating something. And often the most obvious thing that people called it were fusion of East and West. And I always felt really uncomfortable because to me it didn't seem to describe very clearly what I was doing. But then I remember meeting the cultural historian Homi Bhabha and reading his book, The Location of Culture. And he gave me this concept of hybridity, which is very different from fusion, because fusion sort of suggests something very surface. You put a sitar and a violin in the same room and then you can create a fusion without actually going very deeply into the structure of two different types of music. So I think hybridity was something that I'd always been interested in as a concept, which is where you make something that is born of two different parents, but it looks completely different. It's a scientific word, really. I mean, you can think of the mermaid as a kind of hybrid, if you like.
And I think it's also a factual term in plant genetics. No?
Yeah, of course, it's a genetic term. It's a cultural term. So, I was very interested in that word. And so when I read this book by Donna Haraway, Simians, Cyborgs and Women, it was about kind of a post-human experience. That's really what she was describing. And how the digital world in some ways had created this possibility of being post-human. So Phantasmaton really came out of those thoughts of hybridity, of being post-human. We looked at classical hybrids like mermaids, centaurs, and various Indian, for example, one of the avatars of Vishnu is half man, half lion. I remember, I think I invited the dancers to make their own hybrids. I think we had animal and human, machine and human, because that's another hybrid. I mean, a robot in a way is a bit of a hybrid in some ways. It's humanly programmed, but made of material that's not human. So we looked at all kinds of different hybrids, and I think a lot of the vocabulary came from that.
It's interesting, isn't it, that you talk about mythological creatures and, in fact, very old ideas of the world as illusion in religion and myth and stories. And yet it sounds like science fiction picks up many of those themes but projects them into the future rather than the past.
Yes, I mean, I think it was during Phantasmaton that I was reading that someone had been implanted with a heart from a pig, because they found that the pig actually was the closest to a human being in terms of its organs. That's the kind of thing, I mean, actually, you could mythologically have a half pig, half man. If people ever made that hybrid, they were kind of not basing their ideas on nothing. They seemed to be actually in some ways being quite prescient.
A big influence on your work was, in fact, the film Bladerunner. Can you tell me about how that appeared in the work?
Yeah, Bladerunner is one of my all-time favorite films, and I took lots of things, and I still do. One of the things that I've always been amazed by, it's a moment that I just love in Blade Runner, is when Deckard, the bounty hunter, he looks out of his apartment and actually what he sees outside this giant screen, it's an advert for something, but it's actually a very classical image of this woman in traditional Japanese dress. It was just such a strange juxtaposition of taking this very historical image and then putting it in this dystopian world. I just found that positioning of something that looks so much like cultural memory, but by repetition, you make it into something completely different and you amplify the artifice of memory. And of course, that was a theme in the film, because I think one of the shocking things I found about the film, but more than the film, the book by Philip K. Dick, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? Because I think one of the shocking things where he just sort of gives us this speculation. He just says, well, maybe memories are not that organic and mysterious. They're just bits of chemistry and neurons stitched together. So actually you can implant memories into these robots. So suddenly you just feel like the ground you've been standing on has just opened up and you're falling into this abyss. Because if you can't trust your memory, then what can you trust, So I knew that I really wanted to kind of think about that figure, but use the Bharatanatyam dancer, because for me that really was the cultural memory. It was like a sort of an icon or a talisman which connected people like myself to something very ancient and very specific to a particular culture. But then it also had the possibility to sort of fracture and become, a digital entity with all its kind of instability that implies. So I turned to Pete Gomes, who's a filmmaker I had met at the time, and I was really thrilled because he was interested in exactly that same area. And so we had a really creative time looking at what would be an iconic Bharatanatyam moment. And I chose the glance. It's a very powerful tool in Bharatanatyam, different types of glances. And so we chose that moment of a dancer glancing.
My name is Pete Gomes. I'm a collaborator with Shobana and Jeyasingh on Phantasmaton. I had quite a loose brief. I shot a dancer in the studio and then I went to play with the material, basically. So a lot of the work was done in post-production. At the time, I was working a lot with artificial life program, and got really obsessed by John Conway. I was really into Eno, who'd been playing with artificial life. There was a lot of work going on with generative systems, and I really started to experiment with how I might play with generative images and video. I was completely obsessed by a very obscure program called Star Logo, which had been developed by the Santa Fe Institute in Mexico. So it was an academic project to develop an artificial life program that kids could play with in school. So it was basically, how do you allow kids to program artificial life games? So I found this, and I found that the program could generate QuickTime movies. So I got really obsessed by generating patterns and then matting. So matting is where you use video to reveal or obscure parts of the image. So I started to develop these images that were disruptions of the figure I'd shot, which was a figure in traditional Indian costume. It was a traditional Bharatanatyam dancer, and I shot her in colour on video. So I was trying to combine these elements of artificial life patterns, generative patterns, and this figure, and that really became the spine and the visual look for the work.
I think he did a really amazing job of giving me this figure, this artifact, which really sort of set the scene for everything that happened on stage. It was like a motif, because you had this woman who filled the stage sometime, or sometimes she was in the background. She was a sort of a digital goddess, and it was that image that became the set for Phantasmaton.
It was the first time I'd worked with choreography, and the process of me making an image that was in collaboration that ended up on the stage was really extraordinary. To go and see it at the South Bank, I really enjoyed it. And I particularly enjoyed the problem solving, a kind of scenographic problem solving, in the way that you had to balance or really consider how a moving image on a screen could potentially distract or complement or supplement images that were going on the stage through choreography. So I became very conscious of developing a practice that was carefully refining the rhythm and the correlation between moving image on a screen and moving image on the stage, and never allowing the screen to disrupt the choreography.
I remember reading the reviews at the time. A lot of people were quite spooked by Phantasmaton because they couldn't quite get a handle on what you were doing and why. I remember people saying, wow, that was and then they kind of trailed and didn't know what to say.
I think I probably was exactly the same.
Yes.
If I look back, and I'm totally honest, there were lots of things about Phantasmaton probably didn't quite work in the way that I wanted it to work. But it was a kind of like a manifesto for myself in some ways.
This is Surface Tension, the podcast from Shobana and Jeyasingh Dance, with me, Sanjoy Roy. You can subscribe to Surface Tension on iTunes so you don't miss an episode. And if you are enjoying this series, please leave us a rating or review. Can I pick up on the idea of you not quite knowing what it was about the image that is so seductive with the fact that people are spooked, and suggest that we talk a bit about the Uncanny Valley? Because this came up in a project where you were specifically, I think, dealing with robotics. Tell me about that project and what the Uncanny Valley is.
I was very, very lucky to be offered sort of an extended residency at King's College London, where basically I was given the freedom to talk to a selection of academics whom I thought might be interesting to talk to, and also come up with an idea of how, as an artist, I could mediate the expertise that there was at a place like King's with all its brilliant research, and to see whether I could use it to kind of make artwork, or perhaps clarify what I was doing, or otherwise perhaps introduce my way of thinking to those academics that I was working with. So it was a kind of like an exchange. And so I chose academics who were making narratives of the body, like choreographer was. So I worked in the Department of Informatics, who were working on AI and robots. You know, I was told about this feature called the Uncanny Valley. So in trying to put AI and make artificial beings which were human looking, what they found was that what human beings didn't like was when they thought it was human, but then something very, very minor made them realize that it wasn't. And that feeling of alienation, they called that the Uncanny Valley. That was a concept I also, again, as a choreographer, I just found it very interesting. What we decided to do was the students at University College London, with the help of Rory Glynn, who was the director of the Bartlett School of Architecture, they actually built me a robot which was going to be programmed with certain movements and behaviors. And then I was going to see whether I could then choreograph a duet with this entity and a human dancer. So I was just testing that thing about the Uncanny Valley. I was looking to see how dancers would respond to actually partnering something which had independent movement. It had a pattern of moving like another dancer would, you know, that they were doing a duet with, but obviously it didn't look human.
I'm Rory Glynn. I'm the director of the Interactive Architecture Lab at the Bartlett at University College London. I had been working with robotics in my own practice and also working in realms of performance. And so we came together really as a sort of trio, sort of to find some sort of, create some Venn diagram to find some kind of piece of work that sat between her world of choreography and dance, the work of the robotics engineers, and our work here at the Bartlett, which deals with the design of spaces, performance spaces, basically.
You know, for various reasons, mostly to do with funding, it wasn't really a fully human-looking robot. It was more a robotic arm. But it had some of the qualities of how people actually go about making these robotic entities. It was kind of trying to engage with that idea of a human being which had all kinds of maybe, very distracting ways of moving, with this other much more organized, perhaps a more perfectly choreographed entity, because it was very economical in its movement. What would that partnership be? That was Trespass.
We developed a custom actuated mechanical device, we call it. But what we were building in a sense was something that was robotic in that it had motors and sensors and so on. But actually, it was also completely unlike any robot that you'd buy off the shelf, right? So it wasn't fully actuated. So out of the 3 limbs that came out of its center, only one of them was motorized. 2 of them were essentially free spinning, so essentially had properties a bit like a chaos pendulum. And then there were also brakes on them, which meant we were able to lock any one of those joints at any moment that we wanted to. That's not a normal thing to do when you're building a robot arm, but it allowed us to explore a whole series of behaviors potentially interesting for a dancer to engage with. And were also interesting for us, interesting for the robotics department, who perhaps aren't asked to do things like that very often because they're always dealing with precision, they're always dealing with repeatability, and what we were dealing with was elements of chaos and unpredictability, qualities usually seen as troublesome to engineers.
The robot arm was a rotating arm with an articulated, independent thing which I thought looked a bit like a head of some kind that moved slightly independently. But the interesting thing was there were two solos who were interacting with this rotating arm. The bit where you suddenly go, well, that's spooky, is where you think that the dancer is interacting with a subject. You suddenly project the idea of a subject onto the robot, which you know is not there, or you don't imagine is there until certain moments in the piece. It's happening inside our heads, but we think that there's some kind of subjectivity to the robot, and that's the uncanny valley bit.
Even something that doesn't look anything at all like a humanoid. It could just be a platonic solid moving around on a stage, can seem like it's alive and can seem like it has personality just by the way it moves. As soon as it starts to move in response to the dancer, it starts to look like it's creeping up on them, or like it's intimidated, or it might appear suddenly to become very forceful. Those moments where we stop seeing it as a machine and start understanding it through our own understanding of social agency, that moment does trigger the kind of familiar, unfamiliar experience of the uncanny. And one of the interesting things about the uncanny is that it has this aesthetic potency, both in that it has a certain darkness and fearfulness to it, but it also triggers parts of the playful, childlike mind, the bit where we project ourselves playfully and creatively onto objects that are not alive. So it has this kind of dual life, both as a sort of terrifying object in some ways, but I think it's also creates a certain amount of excitement, and it encourages viewers to participate and imagine, and that actually is very positive and stimulating part of that whole experience.
So what did you learn from the collaboration with Shobana?
We learnt about the kinds of tools that enable collaboration between choreography and architecture, and that was great. And it certainly was one of the stimulus for a new master's program that I've started here at UCL, which is called Design for Performance and Interaction. That Venn diagram that I think was at the heart of this piece is now really at the heart of a master's program here at UCL.
Let me move on to a piece. You said it was your most pure science piece called In Flagrante. Why was that the most pure science piece you've done?
Because it was commissioned by someone else. So it didn't come from an idea that I had. And it was commissioned by Professor Marina Wallace at Central St. Martin's. So it was a commission really with a very, very simple task that I had to do. There was an exhibition on cell division, mitosis. It was a Europe-wide exhibition, and most of the exhibition was actually about scientific fact. But they invited 4 artists to kind of give their take on the subject. Maybe they thought, well, perhaps that might make it easier for the audience to understand than, read a lot of formulas or scientific information. So my task was very simple. I had to communicate how cells divided. So actually that kind of gave me this huge task of understanding.
Scientists are, very much into their own world. Choreographers and dancers are in their own world, so it's bringing the two worlds together.
I'm here with Marina Wallace in her beautiful sunlit apartment in Notting Hill. Marina, tell me about the dialogue that you opened up between Kim Naismith and Shobana.
We were looking at illustrating what happens in mitosis for a general public. Now, of course, that's a very, very difficult thing to do because we're dealing with minute cells, we are dealing with chemistry, with genetics. So what I thought was that there can be an intermediary, somebody who talks between myself and the scientists and who can, in an open dialogue with the scientists, bring about what the scientists are actually doing in their labs. They were looking at cells dividing. There is a beautiful movement and there is almost a dance of cells dividing. It's an extraordinary thing to watch when you see it through the microscope. And when the scientists started explaining to me that what was happening was due to movement, to the separation of cells, it was clear to me that what they were emphasizing was the creation of life through movement. And dance came up in my mind immediately. And a number of artists and scientists were paired up, and one of the pairing was Shobana and Kim.
My memory of my biology lessons at school weren't that helpful, but I just found talking to Dr. Kim Naismith, who's the head of biochemistry at Oxford, and after having worked decades on this subject, he's still, when he talks about it, you can see that there's a kind of a freshness and an enthusiasm for his subject.
From what you told me, he was a little bit doubtful about how dance may become involved in this quite detailed technical...
Yeah, I mean, he was a man who had spent all his life studying the intricacies, in a very scientific way about cell division.
And you hadn't even done well in biology at school.
No, I hadn't even done biology A-level at that point.
No, I knew Shobana and I knew that we would get on. It was very unclear to me whether we would be able to speak the same language, because obviously we come from completely, not just different disciplines, just sort of whole different sort of perspectives on life.
This is Kim Naismith, Professor of Biochemistry at Oxford, down the line from France.
But in fact it was incredibly easy to communicate. I remember being incredibly impressed by how Shobana had grasped what we did, even though she doesn't have a particularly strong scientific training.
I just kind of felt it wouldn't do the subject justice to do an artist's impression. I really wanted to get under mitosis and really understand it, just as much as Kim did. Obviously, I can't understand the same depth as he has. Obviously, I haven't spent 30 years studying it, but as much as it's possible, so that it would really inform the choreography. I decided I didn't want to have a live dancer in a gallery. There was a dancer, but they had to be mediated to a great level. So it was a film of a dancer directed by Ravi Deepras, which was then further animated. And I had to kind of choreograph the dancer in the frame. It was a single frame of that film. And me understanding and trying to find out how I can communicate the process of mitosis, but in a dramatic way and in a way that's incredibly watchable through a single dancer. So that was the challenge of In Flagrante. And one of the central sort of dramas of cell division is there's something called a microtubule, which has to connect to the chromosome, which is in pairs, and then it has to pull the two chromosomes apart to either end of the cell wall. Now, you think that's a kind of easy thing. It must be all choreographed and planned, but actually it isn't. In fact, that process is called search and capture. That kind of gives you a flavor of what's happening. So it's really full of tension and full of drama. One of the things that I remember asking Kim was, if it was a dance, that moment, what sort of dance would it be? And I was surprised because he said rock and roll.
I'm surprised, okay. Yes.
And I realized why he said that. The reason he said it, because, when people jive, that the partners actually hold each other's hand. And there's a kind of give and take because you're trying to control this very fast-moving energy just through the tips of your fingers. And there's a kind of a pull and a push. And it's very instinctive, isn't it? Because you're trying to swing your partner. They're using you for balance. And you're also trying to, throw them over your shoulder or whatever you're trying to do.
Yeah, it's both a dynamic and potentially unstable.
Yes, that's right. It's a give and take. And it's very, you could break contact and then both partners will end up on the floor.
It's all to do with two partners and they're moving in some coordinated way, but at the heart of moving together is pulling in opposite directions. That is, you have to generate tension in order to dance together with another person. So that fundamental tension is exactly the same tension that is going on in mitosis.
We created a situation where Kim was within the environment that Shobana worked in, like Shobana was within the environment that Kim worked in. So it was sort of two laboratories meeting, as it were. When the dialogue is successful, there is something new that is born out of that conversation that is surprising and moving because it's new. So it's a birth, in a way. It's a creative act.
I mean, at one point, he actually came to the studio because I was trying to film the dancer moving but without gravity. So we had this idea of tying a rope to the dancer's wrist and someone really pulling her, so she'll have to move against the rope.
I was holding the rope and they were pulling on the rope in order them to create particular configurations of their body, which wouldn't have been possible if they didn't have something to pull against. So yes, I was there, not an object in the film, but I was a sort of a prop.
We had watched cells and chromosomes magnified by microscopes in films with the cells dividing and the dance of the cells moving. And it was very interesting that we were then watching a short film of a body moving with its limitations, the symmetries and the asymmetries of the body, the sense of balance, the stability and the instability, which is something that Shobana had taken in from the conversations with Kim. So in itself, the output was a surprise, and the public received it very well, and it contributed beautifully to the series of exhibitions that were put on for the project.
What gave me the greatest pleasure at the end was that Kim really liked the end product. I mean, he really saw a connection between the film and what he was doing.
I went into it quite sceptical, and I think what emerged was a film that was of enormous beauty and was beautiful in its own right. Somebody watching it without them knowing anything about what it was meant to represent would appreciate its beauty and could do so without having either Shobana or myself to explain what it all meant. And I think that's the most important thing about great art, is it has to speak on its own terms without being explained. And that, to me, is the only thing that mattered at the end of the day, and it clearly did work.
This is Surface Tension, the podcast from Shobana Jeyasingh Dance, with me, Sanjoy Roy. So, Shobana, you've done digital technology, you've done cell biology, some robotics, and you've also had a piece that was very directly related to medicine and virology, which once again you looked quite deeply into the viral structures in your piece Contagion, which was about flu.
Yes, I was asked to pitch an idea for 1418 Now, which was the huge cultural flowering, really, that was part of remembering the First World War. And I was kind of told maybe role of women and trench warfare, maybe slightly overdone. So I was kind of thinking, well, what else do I know? And actually, I didn't really know that much about the First World War. So when I was researching it, I came across this thing called the Spanish flu. And I was amazed, literally dumbfounded to learn that in fact it killed almost 4 times the number of people who died in the First World War.
In the entire 4 years.
4 years. It had a global reach that the First World War actually didn't have, and it affected everyone. The isolated in the Arctic, the people in cities, and yet there's nothing really to commemorate this epic episode in human history.
Of the pieces that we've spoken about, it's also the one where you've moved between science and history in a way. I think that the others are more pure science in a way. So here we have dancers who shift between the roles of scientific viral processes and actual human beings who we recognize as such, not as uncanny representations of strange beings, but as people who we identify as human.
Yeah. There's such a human story there. It would have been very difficult to just ignore that and just concentrate on how the virus worked. And Dr. John Oxford in particular, I had spoken to a couple of virologists before I met him, and they, as good scientists do, they were very excited about just the virus. There's a lot of admiration for the virus and how, in fact, it managed to be so effective. It was a virus dream, really. In fact, millions of people all over the globe before being found out. So I'd expected John Oxford to actually tell me more. So all my questions to him were just about that, technical things about it. And he had written the textbook on virology, which I was kind of trying to read in my spare time. So I really had gone to just ask him for explanations. But in fact, what he showed me was a completely humanist view.
I suspect there's many more casualties than we would have thought and would have wished to think.
So your official working figure would be approximately what?
50 or 60 million.
I'm here with Professor John Oxford, virologist and leading specialist in influenza, and we're in his marvellous house in North London, and I did notice as I walked up the road a car with a number plate which had flu in it, and I thought, this must be the house. John, apart from the car outside, coming inside is coming into something of a treasure trove of wood carvings and paintings and stuffed animals. There's a piano, a banjo, tapestries, books everywhere. It makes me feel how wide-ranging your interests are, even if your specialism is flu.
Well, my interests are wide-ranging. I've got an interest in dance, and so does my wife, in music, in acting, in writing and reading, in the First World War. My father was in the First World War. That's when the influenza pandemic started, so I'm interested in that. My focus is the pandemic of 1918. It's not because I'm a historian, because I'm not a historian. I'm a vaccine-orientated virologist. My orientation is to fight this virus and to encourage the community to fight it. As time goes on, more and more people inhabit this little planet of ours. There will be more and more of these infections and more virus like influenza. And we have to get that sorted now.
So my impression is that Shobana came to you thinking that she would only learn about the flu virus, but she ended up learning all of these things, not just about the science, but the humanities and the history. Can you tell me how you first met Shobana? Did she come to this place? What were her questions and what were your answers?
I learned a lot from Shobana. I mean, I go to dance. My wife's a dancer. I go to dance, ballet and what. But I thought, my goodness, how are you going to choreograph a modern dance with flu, my old love? And I said to her, how are you going to do it? What's the first thing? She said the first thing, let's talk about the love of your life, influenza, and then we'll talk about the love of my life, which was choreography. And so we got on all right.
What were her first questions to you?
What does it look like? How do you handle it? And I had my model viruses. And of course, my model viruses is about 1 billion times bigger than a real one, but quite an accurate model. So I was able to dissect open in front of her with the model and say, now this is this little spike. This enables the virus to stick on your nose when someone coughs into your face. And this little spike enables it to move down the respiratory tree. And this little spike enables it to get inside the cell. So we were able to dissect open what happens, how quickly it happened, and then view that virus in the sense that you could see the genetic structure, the genes. I mean, how many genes have we got? We got 20,000 at least, in our body. That virus has got 8 little genes, and so you can think immediately, how could a little 8-gene affair, 10,000 of which could sit on a pin's head, how can they do all this? How can they get inside you and kill you? That's the big question. But then I think the difficulty of explaining the concept of 50 million people dying and how we argue about it. So I said to her, the way to do it is to pick one person and develop that one person. A bit like Titanic, a bit like Jack and Rose. You don't need to talk about the whole ship. Just talk about one couple.
And he said, the real heroes for him from the First World War were really those nurses. And not just even nurses, the mother, the sister, the aunt, the neighbor who tried to help the others who had contracted the flu. And coming so soon after all the deaths in the trenches, it must have been a huge shock to everybody. He said they were the real heroes for him. And he made me totally change the way I had been imagining Contagion to look like. Most of the narratives of the Spanish flu are in the memories and the letters of women, because the only thing that could save you during the Spanish flu pandemic was good nursing, and that was always delivered by women. So it's really a kind of a huge women's narrative that has not really been told.
75,000 healthcare workers, nurses and doctors, when they should have been, they were sitting here in England, suddenly found themselves on the Western Front, thrown into something they couldn't contend with. They were not soldiers. The women had never seen anything like it. Half the men hadn't. And so they didn't get medals. They didn't. They just didn't. By the time the flu got going, they were still out there. And by that time, the casualties from war were diminishing, and the casualties from infection were increasing as more of them were knocked off their feet by the Spanish flu. They've just never seen a speck of blood in their lives. Suddenly they're chopping off people's arms. Really terrible stuff. So those women, particularly, I think, were heroes.
You did have some sections where you tried to choreograph some of the viral processes. How did that happen?
Well, I had to stage this battle between the virus and the cell, because that's really what happens when you have any kind of flu. This alien entity enters your body in very stealthily, with a lot of intelligence and forethought, gets into your system. And so instead of the cells replicating themselves, as in mitosis, they start replicating the virus. So it's as if an alien has come in and started making clones of everyone.
It's a classic sci-fi plot.
It is a classic. It is.
We're under
it's
attack
very sci-fi.
from aliens.
But, in the cold light of day, it's not an emotional thing. It's a purely evolutionary thing. There are these two entities, the human cell and the virus, and they're engaged in an evolutionary battle like everything else in the universe. And it was that staging that battle that I found, yes, it's a very science fiction scenario. And one of my references was actually, again, one of my favorite films, Terminator 3, because in that particular one, it was a female Terminator. And instead of just relying on the muscular He-Man, they had a female Terminator who actually didn't, she wasn't muscular, she wasn't masculine looking, she was actually a very fit female. But I think her movement and behavior had been choreographed really interestingly. Their final fight, which is edited, I think in a really interesting way, there are these two entities who are fighting without emotion. That's the way it's edited. So they want to do maximum harm to each other, but without any emotional engagement. So that's really what I took to the viral section of Contagion. So, for example, the dancers don't look at each other and they try and do a warfare, which is a bit like that. It's that warfare between the cell and the virus, which is totally unemotional.
So you were thinking of the virus as Terminator 3 and and the cell as not thinking of, but you used the analogy to produce, shall we say, a particular effect. Well, I think Contagion had carried forward many of the things you'd learned from science and science fiction and embedded it into a more located...
it's a very finally, it's an incredibly moving human story.
I received a telegram. Your wife is gravely ill. Come immediately.
So it had text, and that's one of the things I really wanted to bring in, is actual letters that people had written during that time about things that happened to them.
The river Ganges was swollen with dead bodies.
So there was this moving description by an Indian writer who basically saw his whole family die within a few days. A letter written by a Scottish girl about how she survived because her mother nursed her so well.
It was most difficult to persuade those who had not yet seen other cases.
And a doctor describing actually what the virus does to the body.
The physical signs were most variable. In most cases, the patient had been ill for a day or 36.
John, you went along to some rehearsals for Contagion.
It was pretty near the London hospital. And I'm not used to rehearsals, and especially in dance. It all looks so difficult and not posh at all. I always used to think that dance was posh, Covent Garden and all that. And there were these young people all laying out, and they were lying there and on white, like beds, really. And the music was extraordinary. I mean, the music was like music concrete, but one stage removed from that, like doors squeaking open and things like that. So, it was not something I instantly recognised, but I began to, what were the wonderful, strange music? And I began to think this was strange, that some were into something special here. But of course, in 1918, we were into something special. 50 million people, and there was nothing more special than that, if you like. So I felt that already I was beginning to be pulled into this, unexpectedly. And she's going to create something that's worth creating to be a memory for what happened. I felt that Shobana could get us into another plane, and that was going to be something that would be wonderful. She had more to say about it than I did, in a sense.
Seeing the work and going through the process, did you take anything new from it that you hadn't expected?
I took the intensity from it, I've seen the medical records of some of the people at the hospital are coming through. But it's one thing reading these cold statistics and cold things about the pathology and the microbes and all the clinical things. But Shobana can bring it alive. She can bring that affliction alive and pace it out in front of us. And I was really impressed with that, I can tell you. I was thunderstruck.
Those human voices were very important. And also I had a brilliant team who, with their visual design, the projections and the music and the lighting, they all tell the story. So together, I think we try to do the slightly impossible task, as you say, of making something have that objectivity of science, but at the same time also not miss out on the very personal, the very intimate.
Thank you, Shobana, for that fascinating tour through where you revisit the biology that you never managed to get to grips with as a schoolgirl, and you've returned to it in your own way, and it's been really quite a trip, I think. Yes.
It's a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to Surface Tension, the podcast from Shobana Jeyasingh Dance. For more episodes, subscribe to Surface Tension on iTunes, visit our website at shobanajayasingh.co.uk or follow us on Twitter at @sjayasinghdance for updates.